question number 34, why did Israel split into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah, and how did that affect God's relationship with each? And so here we're going to stick with the Old Testament and kind of looking at these kingdoms that's going on. Now, if you remember your Old Testament history, what we've got is we have King Saul. Oh, let me change to a different. We've got King Saul, all right? Now, Saul is replaced by David, okay? And then David is then his son Solomon takes the throne, okay? This is called the United Kingdom. And the reason why this is called the United Kingdom is because the 12 tribes of Israel were all united together, even though there was a little bit of a period of time in between Saul and David where they were divided. You know, these 12 tribes of Israel really didn't get along very well. You know, you kind of go back to the book of Judges and you kind of see that it really was a loose confederation of tribes, and they really weren't getting along and would not have gotten along very well. The only thing that really tied them together was God. You know, they worshiped God. They had a centralized worshiping of God. They had a priesthood that was scattered all throughout all of the tribes. And so those were things that unified them and brought them all together. Okay? And so this kingdom, after Solomon, all of a sudden split. And what we have are two different kingdoms. The kingdom of what's called Judah. It is the northern kingdom because it was the northern tribes. This is also in the Bible called Israel, even though Israel sometimes is for both of them together. This is also called Samaria because Samaria was the capital. Judah is also Jerusalem because Jerusalem is that capital. And sometimes the northern kingdom is called Ephraim because that is the main tribe. Okay? So, a bunch of different names, but the same thing. We've got this kingdom versus that kingdom, and so now we've got the time of the divided kingdoms. Okay? All right, so there's a little bit of an Old Testament history lesson. Now, why did these kingdoms split, and what did that do as far as God's recognizing them? That's what the question is. Okay, so let's take a look at the book of 1 Kings, chapter 11. In 1 Kings, chapter 11, what we see is Solomon here. Now, Solomon, if you remember our studies in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon started out really good, a really godly king, but his wealth, his power got the best of him. He had a whole bunch of different wives from all kinds of different countries. These wives brought in their religion with him, and it says that in his old age that these wives led Solomon's heart astray, and he started to offer up sacrifices to these other gods. And what we see is that in chapter 11, starting in verse number, let me see here, verse number 9, it says, "The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord his God, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command." Just imagine that. If you had God who would appear to you twice, and especially if you specifically knew, God doesn't want me to serve other gods, you'd think that you get the idea, right? Especially if you're as wise of a person as Solomon, and you go, hey, I'm not going to worship these other gods. But, you know, even the wisest of people still make some pretty bad mistakes. And so in verse number 11, it says, "So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David, your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David, my servant, for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And so that is the reason why we've got the dividing of these two different kingdoms. And that is Solomon sinned against God. And so in judgment of Solomon's action, God said, okay, you're not going to be king of the entire tribe of Israel. Well, you are going to be king, but not your son, okay? But I'm not doing it because of you. I'm doing it because of your father, David. David was a man after God's own heart. David had some promises of the Lord. And so because of that, God said, I'm going to do it in the days of your son. And also, what's going to happen is that because of the faithfulness of David and because the temple was in Jerusalem, then there was going to be this split of Jerusalem and Judea from the rest of them, okay? Now, what about God's relationship with Israel? I mean, how does that affect it? Because when you think about it, we've got a couple of different covenants that God makes with Israel. The first covenant that we've got is with Abraham. And God's covenant with Abraham was that Abraham was going to be the father of many nations, including Israel, and that all the earth, countries of the earth was going to be blessed through him, and they were going to be a blessing. And so there's more to it than that, but we'll just leave it right there, that Abraham's going to be the father of many nations, Israel is one of them, and that all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed through him. How the nations of the earth are blessed through Abraham is because from Abraham comes Jesus. Since Abraham is the father of the Jewish people, Jesus is born King of the Jews, then therefore that's how all the nations of the earth are blessed. Okay? So there's that covenant. Now you've got the covenant that God made with Israel when God brought them out of Egyptian bondage. And he said, I'm going to be your God, you're going to be my people, if you do what I say. Okay? So this one is one blessing, and it really doesn't matter what they do necessarily. This one is, I'll be God, you're God, and you'll be my people if law is kept. Okay? And so the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that is the if here. Okay? If you keep those laws, then I'm going to be your God. If you break those laws, then I am going to judge you. All right? Now we've got David. And here is this covenant that God made with David. And the covenant that God made with David is that, more or less for our discussion, is that he would never stop having a son on the throne. Now, how is that possible? Because we don't have any more king of Israel. Well, it's not really talking about the lineage of those sons. It's talking about Jesus. Okay? But while Israel is a kingdom, therefore, that's why we've got these promises. So, coming back to this, why is it that we have this nation and this nation? It's because of this covenant right here, right? You know, Solomon sinned, and there's going to be judgment because of that, but because of the promises that God made to David, we have this and this. Now, what happened to these countries? Well, in 36 BC, this northern kingdom had sinned so much against God that God allowed the Assyrians to come in and judge them. Then in 586 BC, same thing happened with the other kingdom, and that is God using the Babylonians. Okay? And so that is this covenant right here that's in effect, isn't it? And that is, I'm going to be your God if you do what I say, but if you don't do what I say, then we've got cursings coming in. And both of these two different countries, both the northern and the southern kingdoms, both were conquered because of God's judgments. Now, in the Old Testament prophets, there was this promise of a remnant that was going to come about. And that is, from this judgment, God was going to allow people from both the southern kingdom and the northern kingdom to stay intact because of this covenant. Abraham, God still is going to be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. At the same time, they are going to be a blessing as well. Okay? Now, how does that affect as far as these two different kingdoms? Let's take a look at Ezekiel chapter 37. Okay. Ezekiel chapter 37 and verse number 15. The question, really, I don't know if I have it here, but it's basically, with these two different kingdoms, is, this relationship that God has with them with the covenants, is it like, okay, because the northern kingdom, if their way is, are they out of the picture? And the answer is no, they're not, because of what we see here. Verse number 15, it says, "The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, take a stick of wood and write on it, belonging to Judah and the Israelites associated with him. Then another stick of wood, and write on it, Ephraim's stick, belonging to Joseph and all the house of Israel associated with him. Join them together into one stick so that they will become one in your hand. When your countrymen ask you, won't you tell us what you mean by this? Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I'm going to take the stick of Joseph, which is in Ephraim's hand, and all the Israelite tribes associated with him, and join it to Judah's stick, making them a single stick of wood, and they will become one in my hand." And so here we've got Ephraim, all right, which is the northern kingdom. And we've got Judah, which is the southern kingdom. And so what God is telling Ezekiel, take these sticks, write on these two different sticks, Ephraim and those that belong to him, Judah and those that belong to him. And so we've got the tribes that were with Judah, which was just Benjamin. And then we've got the tribes, which all the other 10 went with Ephraim. And take these two sticks and join them together, because in the point in the future, it's going to be one. He says this, continue on down. Verse number 20, "Hold them before their eyes, the sticks you have written on them, and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone, and I will gather them all around and bring them back into their own land. I will make them one nation in the land, and on the mountains of Israel there will be one king over all of them, and they will never again be two nations or be divided into two kingdoms. They will no longer defile themselves with the idols and the vile images or with any other offenses, but I will save them from their sinful backsliding, and I will cleanse them. They will be my people, and I will be their God." And so God is going to bring them all back together again. All right? Okay. So, got any questions or comments about that one? Boy, you guys are tight-lipped. I think Paul's the only one that had anything.
It's all just Israel today, right?
Yeah. Well, it is today. So today, Israel is a nation, but it's not a nation like what we saw in the Old Testament.
It was
Okay.
bigger back then.
Well, it was, well, I mean, at times, yes, like under David and Solomon, yes. Other times, no, I wouldn't say so. But it's different in terms of, in the Old Testament, you've got God's recognition of them. Okay? Now, God still recognizes them as his people, but his emphasis now in the New Testament is on the church. Now, in the future, what's going to happen is when the end time events happen, God's emphasis again is going to be back on Israel. And so that's why the Antichrist's wrath is going to be directed towards the nation of Israel. And when we looked at Revelation, you know, all that was about Israel. Okay? And then later on in the millennial kingdom, that's really where this is talking about as far as these two becoming one.